Okay, we are here in the Washington administration. I did not finish the lecture last night because of fatigue. So we will go through the first five presidents, starting in 1789. Washington's administration. With the ratification of the Constitution came an entirely new American phenomenon, namely national elections. The election of 1788 to 1789, which was held between December and January, gave the Federalists 44 states in the House, with the Anti-Federalists winning only 8. And so you'll notice that Washington has the distinction of being the only president to be elected the very same year he begins to serve. As expected, the Electoral College chose George Washington as president, being the first president to be elected during the same calendar year he begins to serve. And at the same time, the second place contender for president became the vice president, an honor that went to John Adams, although he later claimed that the office of vice president was the most useless in the history of government. Washington had gained much notoriety through his military accomplishments, and he was conscious of the precedent he was setting as the first president. He proceeded cautiously. He adopted many of the administrative policies of the Confederation, and he even asked Congress to reestablish those departments that are crucial for carrying out executive duties, namely those of Foreign Affairs or the State Department, Finance or the Treasury Department, and War. Just to let all of you know, we don't have a Department of War anymore. We have a Department of Defense, and that doesn't change until the 1940s. Washington also introduced an important innovation. The Constitution specified that the Senate must ratify or consent to all appointments of all major officials, but Washington insisted that he, not the Senate, had the power to remove them, an innovation that secured the president's control over the executive bureaucracy. Hence, Washington proceeded to create a cabinet, or an advisory body, which at the same time consisted of only 3 members. Thomas Jefferson became the Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton became the Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox became the Secretary of War. Edmund Randolph will serve as the U.S. Attorney General, so technically you could say that he was part of the cabinet as well. You'll notice that John Adams is not considered to be part of the cabinet, and even after the president begins to run for election with a running mate, it will take a while for the vice president to be fully informed as to all cabinet matters. At this point, because John Adams ran against Washington, it made little sense for Washington to see him as a member of his advisory body. The Office of Attorney General represents the executive branch of the courts, which is part of the function as that branch which enforces the law. While there was a Supreme Court, there was no court system implemented in the states. So the Federalists, who favored strong national institutions, enacted the Judiciary Act of 1789. This system established a federal court system in each state, providing 3 circuit courts to hear appeals from the districts, with the Supreme Court having the final say in matters unresolved. The act also allowed appeals to the Supreme Court concerning federal legal issues that arose in the courts of various states. This assured that national judges, as opposed to state judges, would have the final say on the meaning of the Constitution. So this is really step 1 in establishing the power of judicial review that will not be fully secured until Marbury versus Madison. James Madison, a member of the House, submitted 19 amendments to the Constitution, 10 of which were approved in 1791. This would be the year after Benjamin Franklin's death. And these 10 amendments added to the Constitution were the Bill of Rights. These rights secured personal liberty against the possibility of a tyrannical government. The Bill of Rights legitimized the Constitution in the minds of many anti-federalists, but they did not provide the proper balance between federal and state power. Arguably, Washington's most important decision was choosing Hamilton to be his Treasury Secretary. Hamilton was a prominent lawyer from New York. He was originally from the West Indies, As a delegate to the Philadelphia Convention, he took a strongly conservative stance. He defended the establishment of an executive with near monarchical powers. As secretary, Hamilton devised bold policies to enforce national authority and favor wealthy financiers and merchants. He outlined his plans in 3 groundbreaking reports to Congress, one on public credit, one on the National Bank, and one on manufacturers. These reports lay down a program of national mercantilism, a system of state-assisted economic development. First of all, his report on public credit established a national debt by redeeming Confederation securities and assuming the state's war debts. By war debts, we're referring to the Revolutionary War. He then used the revenues from excise taxes and customs duties to defray an annual interest on the national debt. He deliberately established a system in which our national debt would never be paid off because he wanted to tie wealthy American landholders to the new national government. His plan was opposed on moral grounds by Madison, but it promised great profits for members of Congress who owned Confederation securities. Hamilton's bargaining with members of Congress gave him all the votes he needed to enact his redemption assumption plans. Another reason Hamilton's plan passed is that he made a deal with Jefferson and Madison, who opposed this. Namely, they would give the plan the nod, and in return he would support their efforts to establish the new national capital on the Potomac River just north of Virginia, which is now the site of Washington, D.C. In December of 1790, Hamilton asked Congress to charter the Bank of the United States. The bank would be jointly owned by private stockholders and the national government. He argued that the bank, by making loans to merchants, handling government funds, and issuing bills of credit, would provide financial stability and a respected currency for the American people. Congress passed a 20-year charter for the Bank of the United States and sent the legislation to Washington for approval. Jefferson, along with Madison, opposed this legislation, claiming that the bank was unconstitutional. Thus, the debate between a loose and strict interpretation of the Constitution began in Washington's cabinet, with Hamilton representing the former and Jefferson and Madison representing the latter. Washington agreed with Hamilton on the issue, and so the National Bank was established for a 20-year period. In his report on manufactures, Hamilton convinced Congress to impose a number of domestic excise taxes, including a duty on whiskey distilled in the U.S. These taxes would raise $1 million a year. To raise another $4 to $5 million a year, he proposed higher tariffs on foreign imports. He urged the nation to become self-sufficient in manufacturing, but he did not support high protective tariffs that would exclude competing foreign products. He advocated revenue tariffs that would pay the interest on the debt and defray the expenses of the national government. And the plan worked. As American trade increased, customs revenue rose steadily, and this allowed the Treasury to implement the redemption and assumption programs. The tariffs also had the unexpected result of encouraging rapid settlement in the West, an outcome opposed by Hamilton and supported by his opponents. Since the import of duties brought in 90% of the national income from 1790 to 1820, the government was able to sell lands in the national domain, that is, the Western territories that they inherited after the war, at ever lower prices. The price of Hamilton's success was the splitting of the Federalist Party into 2 factions, with most Northerners siding with Hamilton, while most Southerners sided with Jefferson and Madison, and called themselves the Democratic Republicans, or just the Republicans. Jefferson spoke for the farmer, and thought that the wage earner in the factory lacked the means for self-improvement and thus the ability to sustain a republic. He longed for an agricultural society based on free labor. He saw the American West being settled by the free and productive farm families that would fund Europe with raw materials, and in turn the European manufacturers would return the favor by sending manufactured goods. The turmoil in Europe, most notably in France during the 1790s, brought Jefferson's vision closer to reality since it created opportunities for American farmers. The French Revolution had started in 1789, and 4 years later the newly established French Republic went to war with a British-led coalition of monarchies. As warfare disrupted European farming, wheat prices rose from 5 to 8 shillings a bushel and remained high for 20 years. This brought substantial profits to Chesapeake to the Chesapeake and Mid-Atlantic farmers, and the economies of Georgia and South Carolina were boosted by the increase of exports of raw cotton, which in turn was greatly aided by the new invention called the cotton gin. American merchants profited more handsomely from the European War. In 1793, Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality, which allowed American merchants to trade with both sides. As American merchant ships were able to pass through the British blockade to French ports, they dominated the sugar trade between France and the West Indies. Commercial earnings earned $20 million a year, and this provided work for thousands in the Mid-Atlantic and northeastern states, or New England states. Americans were divided over the French Revolution. Most were happy to see the end of feudalism and monarchy, but most also disagreed with the policies of France's new democratic republic, set up in 1792. Americans with strong religious beliefs condemned France's rejection of Christianity, the setting up of a national and even rationalistic religion, and the execution of Louis XVI, along with 14,000 other citizens. These sentiments helped stir the debate over Hamilton's policies and also aided to foment a domestic insurrection in 1794 called the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred in western Pennsylvania. The rebellion protested Hamilton's taxes on whiskey, which raised the price and cut the demand for the corn whiskey they bartered for Eastern manufacturers. They attacked tax collectors and the authority of distant government, proclaiming the French Revolutionary slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Washington dispersed the rebellion by raising an army of 12,000 troops, thereby ending the rebellion and deterring future secessionist movements. In fact, he led these troops himself into battle. In 1793, the Royal Navy began stopping American ships carrying French sugar, eventually seizing more than 250 vessels. Washington sent John Jay to Britain, who had served as president of the Continental Congress, was a major contributor to the Federalist Papers, which had defended the new Constitution in the late 1780s, and was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court between 1789 and 1795. Jay returned from Britain with a controversial treaty. The treaty acknowledged Britain's right to remove French property from neutral ships, and it required the U.S. government to make full and complete compensation to British merchants to pre-revolutionary debts owed by Americans who refused to pay them. In return, Americans were allowed to submit claims of illegal seizure to arbitration and required the British military to remove its remaining garrisons from the Northwestern Territory, as well as end its alliances with Native Americans living there. The Senate ratified the treaty with a bare two-thirds majority. Washington could have run for re-election in 1796, but tired of political life and longing for his home and a simple life, he returned to his beloved Mount Vernon. He died in 1799. The first-party system, which takes us from 1796 to around 1815, you could extend this to 1817 or even 1820, but we'll just stop it here. The rise of the Federalists and Republicans marked a new stage in American politics, now called the first-party system, which is associated with the two most popular parties, that is, the Federalists and the Republicans, which dominated politics at the time. Now, contrary to popular opinion, it's not like the Constitution says that we have to have parties. And in his farewell address, Washington actually urged Americans not to identify with parties. This is interesting because almost everybody will label Washington a Federalist, and in a sense you could say he sided with Hamilton on almost every single political issue. However, it's probably unfair. It may be very well the case that Washington, formally speaking at least, was an independent, because he just did not like parties. I do have a theory as to why I think the two-party system will always be with us, but I'm not going to share that right now. At this point, most Americans were suspicious of political parties, thinking that statesmen ought to act for the common good and not the good of the party. That said, most merchants, creditors, and urban artisans supported Federalist policies, as did weed-exporting slaveholders in the Tidewater districts of the Chesapeake region. The Republicans had a more diverse constituency, which included farmers like tobacco and rice farmers in the South, those living in the backcountry, and even Germans. In 1796, both Federalists and Republicans called for conventions in the states to discuss policies and nominate candidates. They held parades and public festivals to win public support, and the Republicans nominated Thomas Jefferson as their candidate, while the Federalists nominated John Adams, who won the election of 1796. He won by a handful of votes. The Adams administration will take us from 1797 to 1801, and he's the only president that we're studying in this section who only served one term. Adams' cabinet was as follows. Timothy Pinckney was chosen as Secretary of State, Oliver Wolcott as Secretary of the Treasury, and James McHenry as the Secretary of War. Thomas Jefferson, because he was the runner-up in the election, was the second Vice President of the United States. Now, this cabinet that Adams had was almost, I think the entire cabinet was the exact same as Washington's cabinet when he left office. There was some shifting around during Washington's second term. In fact, Jefferson ended up leaving after the first term because he was so bitter over the fact that Washington always sided with Hamilton in their disagreements. In any case, Adams continued the pro-British policies of Hamilton, which incensed Jefferson. He thus reacted sharply to seizures of American merchant ships by the French Navy. When the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, solicited a loan and a bribe from American diplomats to stop the seizures, Adams charged that Talleyrand's agents, dubbed XYZ by the Adams administration, were insulting America's honor. Thus, this is now known as the XYZ affair. And as a result, the Federalist Congress cut off trade with France in 1798 and even authorized American privateers to seize French ships. Thus, the party conflict, which began over Hamilton's domestic financial policies, spilled over into foreign affairs. As the U.S. fought an undeclared maritime war with France, which really is the beginning of the American Navy, immigrants from Ireland vehemently attacked Adams' pro-British foreign policies. To silence Federalist critics, the Congress, with Adams' support, enacted 3 coercive laws that threatened the individual rights of American citizens. The Naturalization Act lengthened the amount of time one could become a citizen from 5 to 14 years. Now, since most immigrants were voting for Republicans, the Republicans interpreted this as just a political maneuver to remain in power. The Alien Act authorized the deportation of foreigners, and the Sedition Act prohibited the publication of insults or malicious attacks on the president or members of Congress. As a result, more than 20 Republican newspapers and editors, that's not well worded. Newspaper editors and writers for newspapers were arrested, accused of sedition, and thrown into jail. A constitutional crisis resulted from these coercive acts. Republicans rightly charged that the Sedition Act violated the First Amendment. They did not appeal to the Supreme Court since most of its members were Federalists. Also, the court's power to review congressional legislation was uncertain. Madison and Jefferson looked to the state legislatures, urging Kentucky and Virginia Congresses to issue resolutions declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts as unauthoritative and void of no force. These resolutions set forth the states' rights interpretation of the Constitution, asserting the states' right to judge the legitimacy of federal law. The big question mark you might see on your notes there is a picture of Adams that apparently did not translate very well. In the meantime, Hamilton had encouraged Adams to declare war on France to raise patriotic spirits. He also informed Adams of his desire for the U.S. to become a North American empire. Adams called Hamilton a madman and refused to accept his advice. Hamilton, needless to say, was furious with Adams. Hence, near the end of his term as the president, Adams had few political allies at a time when he needed them most. While he is to be criticized for signing the coercive bills into law, he is to be commended for putting country ahead of party by ending the bickering with France. Indeed, America was in no position to enter into a war with Napoleon, and had the U.S. done so, it is probable that the Louisiana Territory would not have been gained at such a cheap price, if at all. It is because he refused to go to war with France that Adams lost the support of Hamilton along with other influential Federalists, and in losing Hamilton, as well as facing formidable opponents and men like Jefferson and Burr, Adams lost the election of 1800. A man of honor, Adams had the burden of having to succeed a giant like Washington as president. He lived out the rest of his years at his home in Massachusetts, continuing to advise politicians and write. His son, John Quincy Adams, would later become president in 1824, or at least he would win that election. 2 years later, on July the 4th, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Adams would die on the same day as his one-time rival, Thomas Jefferson. So this brings us to the Jeffersonian era that takes us from 1800 to 1816, although in our discussions I went ahead and extended that to 1817. But there is fluidity in these things, and so we'll just move ahead. The Jefferson administration takes us from 1801 to 1809. The election of 1800 was, despite Adams' honorable statesmanship, a campaign of name-calling. Jefferson was called the arch-apostle of irreligion and free thought. Remember, he's a deist. Both parties charged state election laws as favoring the incumbent party. Rumors abounded that the Federalists were planning a civil war and a military coup. Adams had lost the support of Hamilton, and Jefferson had a running mate in the brilliant Senator Aaron Burr, Jr. Burr was the son of Aaron Burr, Sr., a minister and the second president of Princeton College, and Esther Edwards Burr, a daughter of Jonathan Edwards. Burr, though he had saved the life of Hamilton during the Revolutionary War, became his enemy after defeating Hamilton's father-in-law in his bid for New York's Senate seat. To be sure, the modern notion of a national ticket had not yet been developed, but the thought was that Burr would not so much campaign for himself as he would for the party in general and Jefferson in particular. Burr's campaigning in New York, along with the Three-Fifths Compromise in the South, gave Jefferson 73 votes to Adams' 65. But ironically, Burr himself received 73 votes, thus tying Jefferson for the presidency. The House is given the power to determine who will be president in the event of a tie. Hamilton hated Jefferson, but hated Burr even more, and through his influence, Congress voted in favor of Jefferson. Thus, Thomas Jefferson became the third president of the United States, and Aaron Burr, Jr., the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, became the vice president. To avoid problems similar to the elections of 96 and 1800, two political rivals serving in the two highest offices in the land, president and vice president, the 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution in 1804, which stated that voters would vote for president and vice president respectively. I want all of you to appreciate the fact that the next amendment to the Constitution will be the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that outlaws slavery, and will not come about until 1865. So it will be a long time, about 60 years before we see a new amendment to the Constitution. The election of 1800 has often been called the Jeffersonian Revolution. Jefferson himself promoted this sentiment, and rightly so. The American experiment in republicanism passed a major test during this year. In many nations, the transfer of political power is met with violence and bloodshed, but starting in 1800, this has never been the case in American history, the election of 1860 being a possible exception to this. In his first inaugural address, Jefferson said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Thomas Jefferson moved into the President's Mansion in the newly formed District of Columbia, where he decided to expand upon the residence by expanding the home outwards by providing two sets of colonnades that were made to conceal stables and storage. Jefferson was actually the second president to reside in the mansion, with John Adams being the first to have that honor. From the time he became president until the time he left office, Jefferson was a champion of the common man. His administration began with an international conflict that was inherited from Adams and the Federalists. During the 1790s, the Barbary states of North Africa systematically raided merchant ships in the Mediterranean, and like many European states, the U.S. paid an annual bribe to protect its vessels. But Jefferson refused to pay this tribute, and when the Barbary states renewed their raids on U.S. merchant ships, he ordered the U.S. Navy to retaliate. Because he did not want an all-out war, despite the fact that it's called the Tripolitan War, due to the fact that many key battles took place in Tripoli, hence the line, "the shores of Tripoli" in the Marine Corps song. And the conflict lasted off and on for 4 years. Since it would increase taxes as well as the national debt, Jefferson negotiated a settlement in 1805 that renewed the tribute, but at a lower price. Jefferson also met an immediate domestic conflict when he inherited a national judiciary filled by Federalist judges. Adams had even appointed the formidable John Marshall from Virginia, who, ironically, is Jefferson's cousin, to be the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the end of his term. The outgoing Federalist Congress even went so far as to pass the Judiciary Act of 1801, which created 16 new judgeships and 6 new circuit courts, which Adams filled with midnight appointees just before he left office. Jefferson complained that the Federalists have retired into the judiciary as a stronghold, and from the battery all the works of republicanism are to be beaten down and destroyed. Jefferson's fears were well-founded. When the Republican legislatures in Virginia and Kentucky repudiated the Alien Sedition Acts and claimed the authority to determine the constitutionality of national laws, the Federalist judiciary responded that the judicial power shall extend into all cases arising under this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which implied that the Supreme Court held the power of judicial review or the power to interpret the constitutionality of congressional law, or in effect, the power to interpret the Constitution. When James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, refused to deliver the commission of William Marbury, one of Adams' midnight appointees, to a federal court, Marbury protested, stating that the terms of the Judiciary Act of 1789 compelled the delivery of the appointment. The case Marbury v. Madison in 1803 went to the Supreme Court. There Marshall wrote that, although Marbury had the right to the appointment, the court did not have the constitutional authority to enforce it, since that power belonged to the executive branch of the federal government. And thus defining the authority of the court, Marshall did 3 things at once, the last being the most important. First, he conceded the argument of Madison, in a sense stating that Marbury could not take his position if the executive branch did not enforce it. Second of all, he voided a section in the Judiciary Act of 1789, essentially stating that it attributed too much power to the courts. And thirdly, by so defining the limits of the courts, the powers of the executive, and the unconstitutionality of a particular piece of legislation, Marshall secured for the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. Arguably, this is the most important Supreme Court decision in the history of the U.S. We will give other contributions of Marshall below. Long before he became president, Jefferson championed settlement of the West. He celebrated the yeoman farmer in Notes on the State of Virginia, wrote one of the Confederation's Western Land Ordinances, and strongly supported Thomas Pinckney's treaty, which allowed settlers in the Mississippi River Valley to export crops by way of the river in Spanish-held New Orleans. As president, Jefferson pursued similar policies. In 1796, the Federalist-dominated Congress had doubled the minimum price of land in the national domain to $2 per acre. In response, Republican Congresses passed a series of laws that made it easier for farm families to acquire land. By 1820, a farmer needed only $100 in cash to buy 80 acres. Inspired by Jeffersonian policies, subsequent Congresses reduced the price still further and eventually, in the Homestead Act of 1862, gave farmsteads to settlers at no cost. International politics challenged Jefferson's vision of westward expansion when, in 1799, the year Washington died, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France, thereby beginning his ambitious campaign to establish a French empire in Europe and in America. In 1801, he coerced Spain into signing a secret treaty that turned Louisiana, the entire territory, back to France. In 1802, he directed Spanish officials, still in Louisiana, to restrict American access to New Orleans, thereby violating the terms of Pinckney's treaty. In the meantime, Napoleon planned an invasion of Haiti, then known as St. Dominic, a rich sugar island which in 1793 had been seized by rebellious black slaves led by Toussaint Louverture. Napoleon's aggression prompted Jefferson to question his pro-French foreign policy. He said The day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and the British nation. He feared that the French might close the Mississippi River to the western farmer, threatening his vision of an expanding yeoman republic. He instructed Robert Livingston, the American minister in Paris, to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. At the same time, he sent James Monroe to Britain to negotiate an alliance in case of war with France. By 1802, Haiti was a lost cause due to disease and the impressive resistance of the former slaves led by Louverture. A new war in Europe was brewing, which would pit France against Britain. Napoleon feared an American invasion of the Louisiana Territory. He also feared that he couldn't secure the coastline in the Gulf, namely the port in New Orleans. And so he decided to sell the entire territory for $15 million, which is about $500 million in today's currency. The strict interpretation of the Constitution, long championed by Jefferson, was now being questioned. Prior to the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson believed that only that which is expressly stated in the Constitution is allowed, but no expressly stated provision is given in any branch of government, or given to any branch of government, to purchase an entire region and or add a new territory. Also, whatever powers are not explicitly granted to the federal government are given to the states. That said, the Constitution does allow the president to make treaties, which must be ratified by Congress. So Jefferson used that provision to make a treaty with France, thereby sealing the deal. The year was 1803. Because he was both a scientist and a statesman, Jefferson wanted detailed information about the physical features of the new territory, its plant and animal life, as well as its Native American population. And so in 1804, the year Napoleon was crowned emperor, he sent his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to explore the region with William Clark, who was an army officer. They took with them several Indian guides and a party of soldiers and frontiersmen. Their 2-year journey through the Louisiana Territory took them up the Mississippi River, across the Rocky Mountains, and venturing beyond the bounds of the Louisiana Purchase, down the Columbia River, through what is now Oregon and Washington State to the Pacific Ocean. They returned the first maps of the vast wilderness and vivid accounts of its natural resources and inhabitants. The Louisiana Purchase was an incredible accomplishment which doubled the size of the United States. Not only so, it allowed America to stay out of the European Napoleon War. And yet this threatened the Federalists. They feared that the Louisiana Purchase would diminish the power of their states and party, and many openly spoke of seceding from the Union. Alexander Hamilton refused to support the plan for a Northern Confederacy, so the secessionists turned to Aaron Burr Jr. for support. Hamilton then began to accuse Burr of participating in a conspiracy to destroy the Union, saying such things and others about Burr at dinner parties and social gatherings. When Burr heard of this, he confronted Hamilton to his face, and when Hamilton responded with yet more harsh words to Burr, the vice president challenged him to a duel. Hamilton, to preserve his aristocratic honor, accepted the challenge. In the summer of 1804, Burr and Hamilton marched 20 paces away from each other, turned around, and, well, it's unclear what happened next. Some say Hamilton shot first, others say Hamilton didn't shoot at all, but what we do know is that Burr shot Hamilton, causing the death of one of America's greatest minds one day later. This effectively ended the political career of Aaron Burr. His term of vice president ended in 1805, and since Jefferson did not choose him as his running mate, he chose George Clinton instead. He moved west to avoid prosecution for dueling. There he conspired with General James Wilkinson, the military governor of the Louisiana Territory. We are not sure what their plan was, but most historians currently argue that the plan involved either the capture of territory in New Spain, which included everything that makes up the western part of the United States today, California, most of Texas, New Mexico, or the establishment of a new nation in Louisiana with Burr as president. In her book, Fallen Founder, Nancy Eisenberg offers substantial evidence for the former, arguing that Burr was engaging in the quite common practice of filibustering, which is the act of private citizens engaging in a foreign power, or engaging a foreign power with their own country, with which their own country is at peace in an act of war, for the purpose of acquiring new lands for the U.S., most notably in Mexico. So what he's basically doing is he's filibustering for Mexico. Interestingly, While we can't know for sure, it would seem that both Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison were willing to help Burr in his endeavors, whatever they may have been. What were Burr's motives in doing all of this? No one can be sure. It may be that Burr was trying to regain much of the honor he had lost in killing Hamilton. In any case, Wilkinson betrayed Burr, arresting the former vice president as he led an armed force down the Ohio River. A highly politicized trial followed, which was presided over by John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The jury acquitted Burr of treason, to the chagrin of Jefferson. Burr would eventually make his way back to England, or make his way to England, even spending some months, if not a year, in the home of Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, and still later back in the United States, at times going by the name Edwards, his mother's maiden name, to hide his identity. He died in 1836 and was buried at Princeton Cemetery near his father and maternal grandfather. United States versus Burr, a trial that took place in 1807, revealed just how fragile national unity really was in the United States. The Louisiana Purchase inspired secessionist schemes in New England and in the Southwest. This series of events, of course, challenged the thesis of Madison, that is, that a large republic is more stable than a small one. The Napoleonic Wars that ravaged Europe between 1802 and 1815 endangered American commerce. As Napoleon conquered European countries, he cut off trade with Britain and ordered the seizure of neutral merchant ships that had stopped there. The British ministry responded with a naval blockade that stopped ships from carrying goods to Europe, including American vessels filled with sugar and molasses from the French West Indies. The British Navy searched American merchant ships ostensibly, that is, in theory, or their stated reason was, to discover if there were any British deserters aboard. In reality, the Royal Navy used these raids to replenish its forces, a practice known as impressment. Between 1802 and 1811, British officers seized nearly 8,000 sailors, including many American citizens. In 1807, American anger over these seizures turned into outrage when a British warship attacked the U.S. Navy vessel, the Chesapeake, killing 3, wounding 18, seizing 4 alleged deserters, and so forth. Jefferson said, "Never since the Battle of Lexington have I seen this country in such a state of exasperation as at the present." To protect American interests while avoiding war, Jefferson pursued a policy of peaceful coercion. Working closely with the Secretary of State, Madison, the President devised the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited American ships from leaving their home ports until Britain and France repealed their restrictions on U.S. trade. This was a risky economic weapon inspired by the boycotts of the 60s and 70s, which tried to hurt the economies of Britain and France with the hope that both countries would allow America to trade with both war parties while remaining neutral. Unfortunately, the policy overestimated the dependence of Britain and France on American shipping, and it underestimated the resistance of New England merchants who feared that the Embargo Acts would ruin them. In fact, the embargo was a disaster for the American economy. Exports plunged from $108 million in 1806 to $22 million in 1808. Not only were American businesses hurt by this, but farmers suffered as well. The embargo prompted widespread demands for repeal. And yet, despite these demands, voters elected James Madison to the presidency in 1808. Even though he had earned a great reputation as a statesman for helping construct the Constitution, writing the Bill of Rights, and serving as a congressman and a Secretary of State, several, including Republicans, feared that he would be too timid and indecisive. And yet, besides his idealism and statesmanship, Jefferson left the mansion with a short-term contribution. His embargo forced the northeastern states to rebuild its old factories, or even build new ones altogether, in order to survive the economic crisis created by the embargo. As one history text notes, the real foundations of modern America's industrial might were laid behind the protective wall of the embargo, followed by non-intercourse and the War of 1812. Also, Jefferson's legacy brought to the fore race relations in the South, for even his political enemies were keen to rumors, which they were eager to spread, of Jefferson's love affair with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. This was not a terribly uncommon practice among the wealthy landowners of the South, and interestingly enough, modern genetic evidence has confirmed that Jefferson was the father of Miss Hemings' children. In his later years, Jefferson would reconcile with his political opponent John Adams, and it is no small irony, as we have already noted, that they both died on the same day. The Madison administration takes us from 1809 to 1817. President Madison acknowledged the embargo's failure, and so he replaced it with a series of new economic restrictions, none of which persuaded Britain or France to respect American interests. The question was, which nation was the primary offender of American interests? As far as those living in the West were concerned, there was little doubt. Britain was the primary offender. They pointed to the continued resistance of the Indians in the Ohio River Valley to defend this conclusion. In 1809, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, revived the Western Confederacy. Tenskwatawa was also known as Lalawethika, rattle or noisemaker, because of his boastful ways and blatant alcoholism. In 1805, at the age of 30, he had a profound emotional experience. He lapsed into unconsciousness, and when he awoke, he claimed to have visited the Master of Life, the main Shawnee god. He then took the name Tenskwatawa, the one who opens the door. He preached the pro-Indian message, urging his followers to shun all Americans, white people, who, he claimed, were the children of the evil spirit who have taken away your lands. Renounce alcohol and return to the traditional ways. When Tenskwatawa founded a holy village, Prophetstown, near the juncture of Tippecanoe and Wabash rivers in the Indian Territory, he attracted warriors and wise men from many peoples, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Winnebago, the Ottawa, and the Chippewa. Inspired by his brother's teachings, Tecumseh mobilized Western Indians for war. Realizing the threat to American settlers, William Henry Harrison, governor of the territory, decided on a preemptive strike. Taking advantage of Tecumseh's absence in the South, where he was seeking support from the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Creeks, Harrison mobilized 1,000 troops and militiamen, and at the Battle of Tippecanoe, he fended off the Confederacy's warriors and burned Prophetstown to the ground in November of 1811. With Britain helping the Indians in the West and seizing American ships in the Atlantic, Henry Clay of Kentucky, the new Speaker of the House of Representatives, and John C. Calhoun, a rising young congressman from South Carolina, pushed Madison towards war. Like other Republican war hawks from the West and the South, they supported the acquisition of territory in British Canada and Spanish Florida. With national elections approaching, Madison demanded British respect for American sovereignty in the West and neutral rights in the Atlantic. When the British were slow to respond, Madison asked Congress to declare war, and in June of 1812, a sharply divided Senate voted 19-13 for war, and the House concurred, 79-49. The causes of the war are hard to determine. Officially, the United States went to war because of violations of its neutral rights, the seizure of merchant ships, and the impressment of American sailors. But the Federalists who represented the merchants and seamen's interests in Congress voted against the war, and in the election of 1812, voters in New England and the Middle Atlantic states cast their ballots and 89 electoral votes for the Federalist candidate for president, DeWitt Clinton of New York. Madison amassed most of his 128 electoral votes in the South and the West, where voters strongly supported the war. Because of the regional split, many historians argue that the conflict was actually a Western war with Eastern labels. The War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War for Independence, and it's one of the dumbest things we've ever done as a country. This war was a near disaster for the U.S., both militarily and politically. Predictions of an easy advance into British Canada quickly proved wrong when an American invasion force had to retreat to Detroit. But Americans stayed on the offensive in the West. In April of 1813, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a small British flotilla on Lake Erie, and during the next month, General William Henry Harrison led an expedition into Canada and triumphed over a British and Indian force at the Battle of Thames. In that battle, Harrison's forces killed Tecumseh, who had become a general in the British Army. Political divisions prevented a major invasion of Canada in the East. New England Federalists opposed the war and prohibited their state's militias from attacking Canada. Boston merchants and banks refused to lend money to the federal government, making the war difficult to finance. In Congress, Daniel Webster, a dynamic young representative from New Hampshire, led Federalist opposition to higher taxes and tariffs, and to the national conscription of state militiamen. The domestic political conflicts contributed to the tide of battle gradually turning in Britain's favor. When the war began, American privateers had quickly captured scores of British merchant vessels, but the Royal Navy soon seized the initiative. By 1813, a flotilla of British warships was harassing American ships and threatening seaports along the Atlantic coast. In 1814, a British fleet sailed up the Chesapeake Bay. In August, British troops stormed ashore to attack Washington City and burn U.S. government buildings, including the Capitol and the White House, or the President's Mansion. And as I've said before, this is how the President's Mansion became the White House. To clean things up, they just whitewalled the mansion and patched it up and moved on. After 2 years of warfare, the United States was stalemated along the Canadian frontier and on the defensive in the Atlantic, and its new capital city was in ruins. The only positive news came from the Southwest. There, a rugged slave-owning planter named Andrew Jackson led a force of militiamen from Tennessee to victory over the British-supported Creek Indians in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and forced the Indians to cede 23 million acres of land. American military setbacks strengthened opposition to the war in New England. In 1814, Massachusetts Federalists called for a convention to lay the foundation for a radical reform in the National Compact, and New England Federalists met at Hartford, Connecticut to discuss the strategy. Some delegates to the Hartford Convention proposed secession, but most wanted to revise the Constitution instead. To end Virginia's domination of the presidency, the delegates proposed a constitutional amendment that would limit the office to a single 4-year term and rotate it among citizens from different states. They also suggested amendments restricting commercial embargoes to 60 days and requiring a 2/3 majority in Congress to declare war, prohibit trade, or admit a new state into the Union. As a minority party in Congress and the nation, the Federalists could prevail only if the war was going badly, a very real prospect. Britain's triumph over Napoleon in Europe, Albert Gallatin warned Henry Clay in May, meant that a well-organized and large army is now ready together with a superabundant naval force to act immediately against us. As the British took the offensive late in the summer of 1814, only an American naval victory on Lake Champlain averted an invasion of the Hudson River Valley. A few months later, thousands of seasoned British troops landed outside of New Orleans, threatening American control of the Mississippi River. The United States was under military pressure from both North and South. Given the hostile attitude of New England, Gallatin feared that a continuance of the war might prove vitally fatal to the United States. Fortunately for the young American Republic, Britain wanted peace. The 22-year war with France in Europe had sapped its wealth and energy, and so it entered into negotiations with the United States in Ghent, Belgium. At first, the American commissioners, John Quincy Adams, Gallatin, and Clay, demanded territory in Canada and Florida, and the British insisted on an Indian buffer state between the United States and Canada. Ultimately, both sides realized that these objectives were not worth the cost of a prolonged war. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve in 1814, retained the pre-war borders of the United States. In other words, we got out of this war barely. Just before news of the Treaty of Ghent reached the United States, newspaper headlines proclaimed an almost incredible victory, glorious news. On January the 8th, 1815, General Andrew Jackson's troops, including a contingent of French-speaking black Americans, the Corps d'Afrique, crushed the British forces attacking New Orleans. The Americans fought from carefully constructed breastworks and rained grape shot and canister bombs on the massed British formations. The British lost 700 men, and 2,000 more were wounded or taken prisoner. By contrast, just 13 Americans died and only 58 were wounded. The victory made Jackson a national hero and redeemed the nation's battered pride. The war did increase national tensions, but the peace undercut the Hartford Convention's demands for significant revision of the Constitution. Besides Jackson's ascendancy from the war, the other thing, of course, as your textbook notes and as everybody knows, our national anthem was written during the War of 1812. The end of federalism and the first party system. The War of 1812 ushered in a new phase of the Republican political revolution. Before the conflict, Federalists had strongly supported Alexander Hamilton's program of national mercantilism, a funded debt, a central bank, and tariffs, while Jeffersonian Republicans opposed Hamilton's programs. After the war, the Republicans split into factions. Henry Clay led the National Republicans. In 1816, he pushed through legislation creating a second bank of the United States, and in part because of the difficulties in financing the War of 1812, President Madison signed it. The following year, Clay won passage of the Bonus Bill, sponsored by Representative Calhoun of South Carolina. This bill, if passed into law, would establish a national fund for roads and other internal improvements. Madison vetoed it, believing, along with other Jeffersonian Republicans, that funding internal improvements by the national government was contrary to the Constitution. During this time, the Federalist Party was in severe decline. Nationalist Republicans had won the allegiance of many Federalist voters in the East, and the pro-forma policies of Jeffersonian Republicans maintained their party's dominance in the South and in the West. With the election of 1818, in which Republicans outnumbered the Federalists 37-7 in the Senate and 156-27 in the House, the die was cast. The Federalists were all but dead, and the first party system was over. So that's why we put the end of the first era right around 1817, 1818. I mean, you can debate as to exactly when this is all going on, or exactly when to date the end of the Jeffersonian era. I do want to go on a little tangent and talk about the tenure of Chief Justice John Marshall. John Adams appointed John Marshall to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801. Marshall was a committed Federalist, and so even though the Federalist Party was all but dead in 1815, he kept Federalist political philosophy alive long after the party itself had disbanded. Marshall would serve as Chief Justice until his death in 1835, and there is only one court case in which he found himself defending the minority opinion of the court, which is Ogden versus Saunders in 1827. Marshall's impact on the court is peerless. In fact, it is he who implemented the practice of the court handing down a single opinion concerning the case at hand, with Marshall almost always being the author of the opinion. There are three principles which inform Marshall's jurisprudence. 1, a commitment to judicial authority. 2, a commitment to the supremacy of national laws. And 3, a commitment to traditional property rights. Several decisions of the Marshall Court are among the most important in U.S. history. The most important is, without a doubt, Marbury versus Madison of 1803, which declared the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, thereby overturning a congressional law. In doing so, Marshall essentially won the authority of judicial review for the judicial branch of government. That is, the Supreme Court now possesses the power to interpret the Constitution. That is, the Constitution says whatever the court says it says. The Supreme Court would not overturn a law passed by federal Congress again until 1857. But the Marshall Court did overturn quite a number of state laws, which further secured the power of the federal government. For example, there is McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. Congress created the Second Bank of the United States in 1816 and allowed the bank to set up branches in the states. To preserve the competitive position of its state-chartered banks, the Maryland legislature imposed an annual tax of $15,000 on notes issued by the Baltimore branch of the Second Bank. The Second Bank protested that the Maryland law infringed on the powers of the national government and hence was unconstitutional. In response, lawyers for the state of Maryland invoked Jefferson's argument that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to charter a national bank. Also, even if a bank was legitimate, they argued Maryland nevertheless had the right to tax its actions within the state. Marshall, along with the nationalist Republicans on the court, rejected both arguments. First, they argued that the Second Bank was constitutional since it was necessary and proper given the constitutionally mandated national government's responsibility to control currency and credit. Second, Marshall argued that the power to tax involves the power to destroy, and hence Maryland's bank tax would render the national government dependent on the states, which is contrary to the original intentions of the American people when they ratified the Constitution. Then there is Gibbons versus Ogden, which occurred in 1824. This decision struck down a monopoly that the New York legislature granted to Aaron Ogden for steamboat passenger service across the Hudson River to New Jersey. Because the Constitution granted the federal government authority to regulate interstate commerce, the courts thought that Thomas Gibbons, who held a federal license to transport people and goods between the two states, could transport people between New York and New Jersey. Fletcher versus Peck in 1810, in keeping with his policy to uphold Federalist notions of property rights, Marshall determined to protect individuals' property from laws passed by state legislatures, and he therefore invoked the contract clause of the Constitution to implement this plan. Now, I'm going to take you to the footnote because this becomes important for later history. During the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson and other Republicans had celebrated the primacy of statutes concerning property rights enacted by the will of the people. In response to this, Federalists warned that popular sovereignty would lead to a tyranny of the majority if state legislatures enacted statutes that infringed on the property rights of wealthy citizens, and Federalist judges vowed to void those laws. Keep in mind that term popular sovereignty as we go throughout our course. Marshall, therefore, I repeat, invoked the contract clause of the Constitution to implement the plan. The contract clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, prohibits the states from passing any law impairing the obligation of contracts. The constitutional delegates included the clause to prevent state legislation that kept creditors from seizing the lands and goods of debtors. In this 1810 ruling, Marshall expanded the clause by broadly defining contracts to include the grants and charters made by state governments. The case itself involved a large grant of land made by the Georgia legislature to the Yazoo Land Company. When a new legislature canceled the grant alleging fraud and bribery, speculators who had already purchased Yazoo lands appealed to the Supreme Court to uphold their titles. The court ruled that the legislative grant was a contract that could not be subsequently changed. This decision safeguarded property rights and, by protecting out-of-state investors, promoted the development of a national capitalist economy. Dartmouth College versus Woodward. This is 1819. Dartmouth was a private college established by a charter granted by George III. By the way, George III is still alive in 1819. In 1816, New Hampshire's Republican legislature enacted a statute that converted the school to a public university. The Dartmouth trustees opposed the legislation and hired Daniel Webster to plead their case. Webster cited Fletcher versus Peck and argued that the royal charter was, in essence, a contract and thus could not be altered by the state legislature. The court agreed and upheld the rights of the college. So those are just a handful of the important rulings under the Marshall Court. And this leads us into the era of good feelings, 1816 or 17 to 1820. The era itself will go all the way to 1828, but we're going to stop in that year for the test. The Monroe administration is around from 1817 to 1825. The two most important events that occurred under the Monroe administration are the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is the staple of American foreign policy throughout the 19th century, and the Missouri Compromise. John Quincy Adams was the originator of the former, while Henry Clay was the originator of the latter. The tenure of John Quincy Adams under President Monroe is impressive. Though his father, President Adams, was a Federalist, John Quincy had joined the Republicans before the War of 1812. He reached national fame for his role in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war. He served as Secretary of State for 2 terms under Monroe. In 1817, he negotiated the Rush-Bagot Treaty, which limited the number of American and British forces on the Great Lakes. In 1818, he negotiated another agreement with Britain, namely the settlement of the 49th parallel with Britain as the border between Canada and the United States, or the lands obtained by the Louisiana Purchase. In 1815, the Adams-Onis Treaty was a treaty where he persuaded Spain to cede Florida to the U.S. Florida will become the 27th state incorporated into the Union in 1845. In return, the U.S. government took responsibility for its citizens' financial claims against Spain, renounced Jefferson's claim that Spanish Texas was a part of the Louisiana Purchase, and agreed on a compromise boundary between New Spain and the state of Louisiana that had been founded in 1812. Other states had been incorporated in the USA for some time, and so just to give you a list of how this country is growing by this time, each individual state declared their independence from the UK before July the 4th. They had to do this because each state had to ratify the proposal that these United States are free from any obligation to the British Crown. So the states going from north to south are New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These are the original 13 colonies who became the original 13 states. Soon after the Constitution is ratified, the land ordinances that we have already discussed were implemented to found other states. So in 1791, Vermont is founded to become the 14th state. In 1792, Kentucky is founded to become the 15th state. Tennessee becomes the 16th state in 1796. Ohio becomes the 17th state in 1803. And Louisiana becomes the 18th state in 1812. And others would soon follow. Indiana is the 19th state in 1816. Mississippi is the 20th state in 1817. Illinois is the 21st state in 1818. Alabama, the 22nd state in 1819. Maine is 23, and Missouri is 24. Now, I'm going to talk about the Missouri Compromise in just a second, but Maine and Missouri are the two states involved in this Missouri Compromise. Adams also persuaded Monroe to articulate American national policy with respect to the Western Hemisphere. Monroe accepted the advice of the Secretary of State, issuing the Monroe Doctrine, which warned Spain and other European powers to keep their hands off of Spanish colonies in Latin America that had fought and secured their own independent republics. According to the Monroe Doctrine, the American continents are not subject for further colonization. This edict was not given the name Monroe Doctrine until 30 years later. It was articulated in 1823. In return, Monroe pledged that the U.S. would not interfere with the international or internal affairs of Europe. Because J.Q. Adams, because of him, the U.S. was able to assert its leadership in the Western Hemisphere, as well as gain international acceptance of its claim to all the land south of the 49th parallel and east of the Rocky Mountains. The Monroe presidency is often called the era of good feelings due to the appearance of a national consensus on nearly all issues, in contrast to the 2 decades of bitter party politics prior. However, the consensus, while real, was transitory. The Republican Party was increasingly divided between a national faction led by Adams and Clay and a Jeffersonian faction led by Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. One of the main disagreements between the two factions had to do with the federal support for internal improvements like roads and canals, which Nationalists supported and the Jeffersonians rejected. Jefferson himself saw the Nationalists as Federalists in disguise. These disagreements would soon produce two parties, with Nationalists calling themselves Whigs and Jeffersonians calling themselves Democrats, and hence the second party system that takes us from 1828 to 1860. I'll elaborate on all of that when we get to that time frame. But now for the Missouri Compromise. Without a doubt, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. In 1817, influential Americans who were worried about the impact of slavery and race on society founded the American Colonization Society. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, himself a slave owner, said that racial bondage had placed his state in the rear of our neighbors, in the state of agriculture, the progress of manufacturers, the advance of improvement, and the general prosperity of society. Slavery had to end, members of the society argued, and freed blacks had to be sent back to Africa. According to Clay, emancipation without removal would be followed by instantaneous collisions between the two races, which would break out in civil war that would end in the termination or subjugation of one race over the other. To prevent racial chaos, the the society began encouraging planters to emancipate their slaves, who now numbered about or almost 1.5 million people. And they had this elaborate scheme to resettle them in Africa. The plan was a dismal failure. Few planters freed their slaves, and the organization raised only enough money to purchase freedom for a few hundred slaves. Equally important, most free blacks rejected the idea of colonization. They agreed with Bishop Richard Allen of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which, by the way, was founded in the 1790s and is the oldest African American independent denomination in our history. And he said, "This land, which we have watered with our own blood and tears, is now our mother country." Since the society lacked the support of both whites and blacks, it transported only about 6,000 African Americans to Liberia, a colony on the west coast of Africa. All right, and the capital, Monrovia, is obviously named after James Monroe. The failure in recolonization set the stage for a new political conflict over slavery, with the Missouri Compromise keeping the peace for 40 years. Congressman Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina warned slave owners that radicalizing members of the Bible and peace societies hoped to use the national government to try to push emancipation on Southerners. Tensions increased in 1819 when Missouri applied for application into the Union with a constitution that allowed for slavery. In response, Congressman James Talmadge of New York proposed a ban on the importation of slaves into Missouri, as well as a gradual emancipation of its black residents. Missouri whites rejected the proposal, and the northern majority of the House responded by blocking Missouri's admission into the Union. White Southerners were horrified. Many believed that this was the first stage towards emancipation of all slaves. So, to underline their commitment to slavery, Southerners used their power in the Senate, where they held half the seats, to withhold statehood from Maine, which was seeking to separate itself from Massachusetts. Southerners had three arguments for their position. Congress would not impose conditions on Missouri that had not been imposed on other territories seeking statehood. They couldn't do this. Second of all, slavery fell under states' government's jurisdiction. Under the Constitution, states exercised control over their internal affairs and domestic institutions, including slavery and marriage. 3, Congress had no right to infringe on the property rights of individual slaveholders. And 4, they also provided theological reasons for their position, namely, slavery is not a necessary evil, as the Founding Fathers said, but a positive good that was sanctioned by Christ and other biblical writers. The controversy raged for 2 years. Then after 2 years of bickering, Clay put together a series of political agreements now known as the Missouri Compromise. A group of Northern congressmen accepted a deal that allowed Maine to enter the Union as a free state in 1820, and Missouri would be allowed to enter the Union as a slave state in 1821, thereby preserving the balance between free and slave states up to that point. Southern senators accepted the prohibition of slavery in the vast northern section of the Louisiana Purchase, lands north of the latitude 36 by 30 degrees. That is the southern boundary of Missouri. Hence, only the land south of the 3630 parallel could have slaves. Okay, so this ends finally the lectures for the class. The test is going to be on Friday, and you should have everything you need to get ready for your test.